you need to ask yourself is, how isolated is my out-of-band management network really? Is it really totally isolated from the internet, or are there people in the NOC who can get there, who are browsing the web at 3 in the morning because they're bored, getting malware on their PCs? You've got to think about these things. So all of this discussion leads me to a few conclusions. I think the most important conclusion is that peer review matters. I think that Cisco did the right thing when they published this interface in an RFC so that we can read it and we can understand how this works and we can provide technical feedback. There's a lot of other technology out there, all kinds of different lawful intercept vendors, and they have not published their architectures. We can't read them. We don't know how they work. They haven't been subject to auditing. And so although I found some security weaknesses in this design, at least we know what they are and what we can do to mitigate them. There are all kinds of other architectures out there that we haven't been subject to any peer review, and we can't be confident at all about their security properties as a result. And we know that nobody ever builds anything perfectly. That's why they've been having Black Hat conferences for years, because there's always new vulnerabilities. And so the reality is that it's not appropriate to expect somebody to go out the gate with an architecture and for it to be free from security risk. What's appropriate is for them to subject that system to peer review and analysis, and over time we can improve its security to the point where it is actually reasonable. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this case. So I think this is how this should work. The other thing is that it's interesting. So in U.S. law, the way that the judiciary and executive, so the way that the checks and balances work there regarding unauthorized surveillance is that if the police go collect information that they weren't authorized to collect and they show up in court with it, it gets thrown out. It's called the exclusionary rule. They can only use information that they obtained lawfully. And so the thing that creates a negative incentive for unauthorized surveillance by the executive branch is the way that the court system operates trials. This piece of software actually pushes the interface between the executive and judicial branch to a different place. And it actually prevents the executive branch from collecting information they weren't authorized to collect in the first place. And that's interesting to me. And if we're going to have software that's actually forming an interface between two branches of our government, it's important that the nature of that interface be publicly described and that we all have the ability to understand how it works. Because it's not just the router vendor and the ISP who have interest at stake in the nature of that interface. We all do. So there are a lot of architectures out there that have not been subject to peer review, and I want to provide an example of one. There's this thing called the Klein Declaration. There's this guy named Mark Klein who used to work for AT&T, and he retired, and he went to the EFF and he told them that his employer had asked him to install a fiber optic splitter in their network and send the traffic on the network off to some room that allegedly is operated by the NSA. And so there's a bunch of documentation on the internet that he provided, that relates to what he is alleging occurred. Assuming he's not crazy, this is a lawful intercept architecture that has not been subject to peer review, and we wouldn't know about it unless this guy was willing to take a risk and talk about it publicly. It has different security properties than the one we've just discussed. In some respects, maybe it's harder. We don't know for sure because it really hasn't been subject to a lot of analysis, but it might be harder to use without authorization because it's harder to generate a packet that manipulates a physical fiber optic splitter. But on the other hand, all of the minimization is occurring in the law enforcement organization or the intelligence agency. There isn't minimization occurring in the ISP. And so it might not be as effective at preventing the collection of information that the organization was not authorized to collect. And that's an important security property too. So this leads me to some personal thoughts about this great debate that's been going on. And I want to tell you, I think some of this, is heresy in this room, and I'm not like a zealot, and I'm not trying to tell you that I'm convinced that these answers are right. What I'm saying is that I've been thinking about this, and these are some thoughts that I had, and I want to present them to you so you can think about it too, and let's talk about it, and we'll see, maybe you can prove me wrong about some of this stuff. It used to be really easy to wiretap with, illegal wiretapping used to be really easy, right? You could open a junction box and hook up some alligator clips and listen to anyone's phone calls. With a portable scanner, you could listen to cellular phones or cordless phones. It was open. And it actually seems like in the last 20 years, it's getting harder to do illegal wiretapping. There are encryption standards in play in these cell phones, so you can't just listen with the scanner anymore. Your cordless phone is probably digital spread spectrum, so it's a little bit harder to tap. A lot of the landline traffic is actually encoded. It's DSL traffic, it's data traffic, and so you need an expensive protocol analyzer in order to listen to it. You can't just like use alligator clips on a phone. So it's getting complicated. I think that it might get a little cheaper in the future because I think people will use software-defined radios as protocol analyzers to listen to DSL and cable modem traffic. But generally speaking, it's much harder than it was 20 years ago, and it's going to remain harder. And so what that tells me is that wiretapping is neither easy nor impossible. It's not black and white. We have not had the broad adoption of end-to-end cryptography that the IETF argued for in RFC 1984. People use cryptography, but they use it if it's baked into what they're doing. They use link layer encryption with their cell phone, or they use application layer encryption with SSL. But if they've got to think about keys, forget it. And so one observation that we could make is that link layer encryption helps prevent illegal wiretapping. We've hardened cell phones effectively. We might want to consider hardening other protocols, even land protocols more effectively, using link layer encryption. I think that will reduce the amount of illegal wiretapping that goes on. Sometimes law enforcement resists link layer encryption when it interferes with how they perform intercepts. And we saw this happen with GSM, where there apparently were some weaknesses that were introduced in order to make it easier for someone with expensive equipment to listen. So we have to ask this question, given that wiretapping is neither easy nor it's impossible. There's going to be wiretapping performed, and we have to ask, how is that wiretapping going to work? And there are a couple different ways it could work. It could work with temporary or permanent devices. A temporary device like a protocol analyzer that somebody checks out of the storeroom and they go hook it up to the network, or a permanent infrastructure that's built into the network. It is the consensus view of a lot of computer security researchers that the permanent infrastructure is a bad idea, and we should stick with temporary devices. There are a lot of august names who have assigned themselves up to that view, including people like Whitfield Diffie and Stephen Bellevin, who have contributed. I can't hold a candle to everything that those guys have contributed over the years. So I'm really stepping out on a limb here by potentially disagreeing with them, but I developed another perspective on this while looking at this stuff. And that is that if you have a permanent infrastructure, you have to have an access control facility to get to that permanent infrastructure. And that access control facility can validate that the people that are using the infrastructure actually have the lawful authorization to do so. If you have temporary protocol analyzers, you can't control them. The guys come in, they check it out, they go do some tapping, they do minimization in the device itself. Maybe they collected some additional information, maybe they didn't. Unless you have some sort of tamper-proof audit trail that's built into the device, there's really no way to tell what happened with it until while it was checked out. So there's potentially a value to having a permanent infrastructure with an access control mechanism, as long as that access control mechanism actually controls access. And so there's a bunch of assumptions built into that. One is that we can close off other means of getting access to the content. We can encrypt the link layers so that the only real way to perform wiretapping is to go through this funnel. Another is that we need to be able to see how the architecture works so that we know it's actually doing what we think. Furthermore, the people who are validating and providing access to that infrastructure need to actually provide a check. There are a lot of people out there who think that the service providers should simply be a rubber stamp. and they should cooperate and assist law enforcement regardless of whether or not they really have lawful authorization, or they're under exigent circumstances, they should just give them access. And that perspective undermines the validity of this technical argument, because if the access control doesn't actually